So good morning to everyone. Special delivery. Thank you, brother.
Do you want this?
I do.
Okay.
So good morning to everybody. Thank you, Steve. Oh, that was really rowdy and Jiminy Christmas. You want another chance? Or you want to just go home now? Another chance. All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Awesome. See what you can do? All you people at home, you just don't know what you're missing. Thanks for joining us as well, though. My name is Randy McCord. I'm one of the elders here and a teaching pastor. So we're just glad you're here, whether you're online or whether you're here. And we hope to proceed and make this a useful time for you. So, how many of you were Frank Sinatra fans? You didn't expect that question, did you? Some of you won't admit it because you think he's old. That's okay. Well, he had a long career, and he's a pretty famous guy, and he had a lot of songs. One of his best songs, I think, was "It Was a Very Good Year." If you don't remember the song, it's something like this. When I was 17, it was a very good year. It was a very good year for small town girls and soft summer nights. And he would go on and he reads about various years of his life, and at the end of the song he looks back and he's nostalgic that yes, it's been a pretty good year. Remember that song, any of you? Okay. So imagine with me now, imagine that Frank appears, still alive of course, that would be helpful, but he appears and he announces that he's going back through his song catalog and he's decided to update this song and re-release it, but he wants to include a verse about 2020. So imagine that. And he's proposing this verse for us to think about. When 2020 came, it made our health disappear. We wore masks everywhere, started fires far and near, while we argued, fought and jeered. Lies were rampant, truth got smeared. It was a very good year. Does that sum it up? Pretty good? All right. So would you encourage Frank to include that in one of his very good year songs? No, I don't think we would we? Has 2020 just been weird from the start for you? Yes. Absolutely. I don't know why, but I do know why. It's been odd. For most of us, the 2020 year has been difficult. Our nation and the whole world has been struggling with a new influenza. We have flu every year, but man, this one's been different. And the responses to it and the disagreements about how we would respond to it have brought about huge disruptions and confusion in our daily lives. And it's now gone on for how many months now? About 9. And it's not over yet. So we're involved in that. It's also been a year of natural disasters. Violent storms on the East Coast, earthquakes around the world, heavy floods in parts of our country, and yet out here where we live, continued drought. And the droughts didn't bring enormous fires and amazing losses and all kinds of pain in the community. It's been very difficult. It's also been a year, if you haven't noticed, of dramatic racial and social discontent. Hundreds, or not hundreds, but many of our national cities are burning. People are unhappy. A lot of dissensions. And for some of us, we remember going through this in the late 60s. And it's like it's happening again. And of course, it's been an election year. Now, I just want to say that as we go along, it's okay to respond. If something comes up in you, I ask you not to throw stuff, but responses verbally are fine. They're encouraged. It's been an election year, and that's provided a platform for the worst I've ever seen in my life of continual rancor and divisions and mean partisan attacks from every side against every other side. Does it feel that way to you? And it's been really, really long. Also, it seems that the basic idea of telling the truth has just kind of gone out of style. So many people and organizations say so much stuff that can't possibly be true that we now have what kind of websites? Fact checks. More than one. You can fact check to see if what that person said is true. How many of you had that in your college curriculum? No, you did not. Okay, and the concept of just common courtesy and civility when people have different ideas or different points of view and a civil discourse about it has just pretty much vanished. It's been a contentious difficult year, and the current shouting of social media and the news media of every side hasn't helped. Am I summing it up pretty well? And through it all, very little has been said about God at the public level. So all this has made 2020, at least for me, an uncomfortable time. But all year, I had this hope, and maybe you did, that, well, we've been in a campaign cycle for literally 2 years, but when we get to November 3rd, it'll at least be a relief. I know a great joke about that, but I won't get to tell it because it's too long, so we'll move ahead. But we thought at least November 3rd might bring an end to the campaigns, and at least we'd have a decision and we can move forward. And that was last Tuesday, and because it's still 2020, it's not over yet. It eventually will be, right? But when it is over, after the lawsuits settle and all these things, we can know for certain that approximately half the nation will still say unfair and be unhappy. Strange time. I could name other weirdnesses of 2020. To me, one of the weirdnesses is the laws that we passed in our own state about hallucinogenic drugs. When many of us are a little older than we used to be. Do you remember in the 60s and the 70s where we had LSD and mind-blowing trips of all kinds of psychotic events, and they weren't particularly considered very good? Well, you can do it anytime you want in Oregon now. And how much have you been taught in your lifetime about the dangers of heroin and cocaine and methadone, or whatever it is? Well, that's not a major crime anymore, but if you get caught with it, it's a $100 penalty. So, is that a good law? I don't know, but we passed it. So, as we're together today, either on the internet or here in this room, I'm just going to confess to you that I'm kind of worn out by the whole thing. How about you? You're unnervingly quiet. You got to agree with me here or it's going to turn out bad. All right, number one, I understand the reason, but I am really tired of wearing a mask. And I'm even more tired of parking my car and getting 2/3 of the way to the grocery store door and remembering, the mask. Do I get an amen for that? Yeah. Oh, my stars. Okay. I'm tired of most of my activities and relationships being disrupted. I'm tired of absorbing so much negative input from every source constantly. And I'm tired of people making things up and telling me that it's the truth just because they don't think I'm smart enough to figure it out. It's been an odd time. And finally, I noticed just recently that it was affecting me, and not in good ways, has made me, if you can imagine, even more crotchety than I normally am. And nothing felt right. Nothing was good. And I just sort of like, for those of you who in our teenage years we were pinball players, I just felt like I was on tilt. You get that phrase? Now, I don't know if I'm the only one here who's felt that way, but it's been very unnerving. And you try not to, and yet it's very real. And we're all having to deal with that. So, what about you? Have you been affected? Yes. I think so. But for me personally, it's more than just an annoyance that my happy routines are being disrupted. It's been an actual type of a grieving process. Because I was fortunate to be born and grow up in a kind of a different society than we seem to be developing now. And I feel a sense of loss over that. I feel a sense of sadness over that. And when I see all the anger and upheaval and dissension, etc., it disrupts me, and it's made me sad, it's made me fearful, and it's made me concerned about what kind of world my grandchildren would live in. And yet, clearly, at least half the people of the country are okay with some of these things because they're helping bring them about. So I'm just maybe really out of touch. And what am I supposed to do about all this? How are you supposed to respond to that? Well, in my world, I personally had to sit down and think about the fact that, well, it's understandable that I may be anxious or sad or distracted or fearful, but it's really pretty far off from the way Jesus said I should be feeling. Would you agree with that? He didn't call us to fear and anxiety and concern. So I took myself on a little Bible refresher course. And I went back and I thought, well, I'm going to look into what God's point of view on all this stuff in the world is. Where does God fit in with governments of the world and societies? What directions maybe has God given me as to how I should deal with all this stuff going on? And like you, I've been reading the Bible a long time, but when I did this sort of intentionally, it was helpful. So we're going to spend our time on that today, if that's okay with you. Now, for you 35 brothers who were with us on Tuesday morning in men's breakfast, I apologize in advance. You might as well just doze off now, because it won't be any better warmed over. But for the rest of us, maybe it'll be helpful. All right, first of all, as we got into this topic, I suspect that many of us feel we're living in a generally hostile environment, maybe. Feel like we get a lot of pushback against our value system and against our Christian lifestyle, and we just kind of feel like we don't really fit in so much. And so there's at least 2 stories we're going to look at today where Bible characters show us how to deal with this. The first one is in Acts 20, the Apostle Paul. He says that from Miletus, he's on a trip, he's traveling when he does this, and he gets to the town of Miletus and he sends to Ephesus for the elders of the church. When they arrived, he said to them, "You know how I lived the whole time I was with you, from the first day I came into the province of Asia." Okay, so catch that. He's called these elders of the church together to help them, give them some instruction, and he's just saying, you remember how I went through my life. So we're going to get an insight into Paul's personal lifestyle. Verse 19, "I served the Lord with great humility and with tears in the midst of severe testing." So he gives us a 4-point stance there. All these scriptures are on the back of your handout, by the way, if you want to make a note in that little box. So he's given us his lifestyle in a very succinct way. Now we all know that Paul was a relentless servant of God, right? And we also know that he was constantly under pressure and resistance from the Jews and sometimes from the Roman government, but it didn't stop him. He would go to the point where he'd get in trouble and there would be beatings. 3 times he was stoned by people to the thorough point where they thought they'd killed him and they went off and left him for dead. He was shipwrecked 3 times and he spent years in prison. Not to mention all the little things I'm sure he didn't need to tell us about where he had an encounter with this person or that person. So Paul was very, very familiar with difficult circumstances, but he continued to serve. And he says, I did it with this formula. I made the decision that I would serve God first. And then I made the decision that God's service would be more important than my personal needs. So I'm showing humility, he says, in my service. And then lastly, I made the decision, he says, that I'll continue to serve and do what it is God's calling me to do, even if it hurts. That would be the concept of tears. So serve God first, with humility, even to tears. And that was his formula. And it worked for him. But I'm sure sometimes it was very uncomfortable. We see another person who lives by this formula, but ironically, he lives thousands of years before Paul had written this formula down. He would be the man Nehemiah. Now, there's a book about Nehemiah in the Old Testament. If you haven't read it in a while, it's pretty interesting. He's a very focused man. The story tells us that Nehemiah was an Israelite, but he had a job as a trusted, politically powerful person in the nation of Babylon. He was the cupbearer for King Artaxerxes II, the king of Babylon, the world's largest nation at the time. Now, Babylon was a totally pagan country, and long before Nehemiah's time, the Babylonians were the ones who God had used to punish the nation of Israel. The Babylonians are the ones who went to Jerusalem and completely destroyed it, went to great pains to knock the walls down and burn the gates and take the people captive, and they spent the next 70 years as slaves, basically, in the nation of Babylon. Long after that now, we have Nehemiah who's come along, and his job is to keep the king alive so he doesn't die from poisoning. He's a very important person in Babylon in his day. Nehemiah's brother comes back from a visit to Jerusalem because some years before, Jerusalem had been allowed to be repopulated if Jews wanted to leave Babylon and go back. So his brother went with that group, and he comes back, and he is giving Nehemiah an update of how people are. And his report is that they're not good. The walls are still crushed, so the nation is completely defenseless. There are no gates to keep them safe at night, and the people are really, really struggling. Now, Nehemiah was a devoted servant of God, and his book makes that very clear. And although he had this high, lofty position, serving the most powerful nation in the world, when he hears that God's people and God's city is in peril, he is deeply touched by that, and he just basically sort of goes into a tailspin, and for the next 3 months, he is mourning, and he's praying to God about the process, and it begins to affect even the way he looks. Finally, the king asked him one day after several months, "Why do you look so sad, and what do you need?" Now, this was a tough spot for Nehemiah because it was illegal to even be sad in the king's presence. But because he was a man who served God, and because he was willing to be humble and put God's needs before himself, and because he'd already been serving through tears for several months trying to get God to help with this problem, he says to the king, "Well, I'd like you to give me a long time off with pay, of course, and I'd like you to pay for all the material costs for me to go back and rebuild the wall." A little bit of a big ask, wouldn't you say? And what does the king say? "Sure, take off." And he does. So the king gives him time, the city gets rebuilt, and things continue in history as we see them because this man was willing to follow Paul's formula. And that's one of the first things I would encourage us to think about. As we are in our time today of difficulty, and as we have been maybe upset from our normal routines, maybe it's on purpose. Maybe it's for God to remind us that we need to be living under a formula like Paul, where we have prioritized service to God as the number one thing in life. And we have prioritized ourselves as to be number two to that need, which would be humility. And we have determined that we will pursue that service even if it's painful, which would be the tears. Worked for Paul, it worked for Nehemiah, probably would work in our society. So we have to decide what we think about that and decide if we're going to do it or not. So going on now, for many of us, the political issues and society changes and this big election we've had to deal with for 2020 has been one of our major disruptions. It certainly has occupied the media and our mindset and our attention. So one of the things we're going to do now is just to go back through texts that I'm pretty sure you know, and we'll learn from these texts that God is absolutely in charge of a few of the governments of the world. Would that be correct? No. God's in charge of all governments completely. And we cannot forget that because it would include our own. Psalm 22, verse 27. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before Him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and He rules over the nations. There's no waffle statement there. It's a statement of fact. God's in charge. Proverbs 8, verse 15. By me, God speaking, kings reign and rulers issue decrees that are just. When you go through the Old Testament, and most of us have, the Old Testament books of Exodus, Judges, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are pretty much the non-stop recount of how God was right there with the Jewish nation for centuries, whipping whatever government needed, putting His own people in timeout with punishments of imprisonment or bondage, overcoming huge armies, doing whatever He needed to do to interfere in the affairs of men to keep His nation where it should be, to try to keep them in sync with Him and to try to help them be the selected people He'd promised He would do for them. God was always active for His chosen people. And you might say, well, that's to be understood. They were His people. They were to be God's place on earth. But then the Old Testament goes ahead and makes it crystal clear in other places that God was equally active and involved in pagan governments. And that's relevant to us today because we live in a pagan government, right? We have a deep separation of church and state. We are not supposed to get those two involved. And so we live in a pagan government, and these texts would be applicable to us as well. Let's look at some of those. Let's look at Daniel 2. Daniel praised the God of heaven. He's talking to King Nebuchadnezzar right here. Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are His. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. Pretty big deal. Kings reign because God put them there. Daniel states this thing again several years later, talking to a different king, King Belteshazzar. In chapter 5, he says, Your Majesty, oh, by the way, this story we're about to read here, remember the story you learned as a kid where the king was having a party and all at once a hand appeared on the wall and started writing? And they knew they'd had a lot of wine, but they hadn't had that much wine. So they brought in somebody to interpret it. Well, that's Daniel, and he's right here at that place explaining what all this means. And he says, The Most High God gave your father, Nebuchadnezzar, sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed, stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is, read this with me, sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone He wishes. Side note, if you've not read the story of Nebuchadnezzar and the life he lived and what God did to him, it's fascinating. He literally took the man from being king because he had become super arrogant and thought he was God, and said, well, we'll just give you a time out. So the man goes out and lives in the plains of the Babylonian era like a wild animal. But after he finally comes to himself, after years of being there, he praises God, and God puts him back in power. That's how much control God has over the governments of men, including our own. Say that with me. Including our own. We could all go, oh, okay. Daniel spoke these words to Belteshazzar, and that very night would be the last night that Belteshazzar is going to be king of Babylon, because they're going to be taken over by a guy named Darius the Mede. Shortly after him, a man named Cyrus is going to come along from the Persian nation, and he'll become the king of Babylon and make it truly even bigger. I bring this up because over 100 years before this Cyrus fella is even born, and 150 years before the event happens where Cyrus is made king of Babylon, God had said in Isaiah 44 that Cyrus will take my people back to Jerusalem and rebuild the worship. And guess what Cyrus's first decree in his first year of king of Babylon was? The Jews can go back to Israel and rebuild the temple and start having worship services, and be sure you pray for me. So God's not only involved in human governments, He's involved in 150-year advanced planning. Pretty complicated, pretty amazing. We could go on with other examples of how God has dealt in the Old Testament directly with the governments of the country, but we'll close with one final one. And if we were to turn to Ezekiel 29, you don't have this text. If we were to turn to Ezekiel 29, he just says, as a matter of course, that he gives the entire nation of Egypt to this King Nebuchadnezzar as payment in service for what Nebuchadnezzar had done in service to God. Think about that. It's like Nebuchadnezzar has taken his armies and marched out and taken over the Jews or whatever and did the things that God wanted Babylon to do. And so Nebuchadnezzar said, well, I better send God a bill for that. That's a ton of people I had to pay, and we had all these costs, and I lost some tanks. And so he sends God a bill. God gets the bill, and he leans over to the clerk and he says, hey, just write a check for Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar. Now that's attempt at humor. You can't send a whole nation to somebody, but God says, I did it. That's the level of control that He has. And so, hopefully, that gives us some hope if we may be worried about the election or the politics of our area, etc. None of it happens without the at least tolerance of God and allowing it to come to play. We can move on to something else. Now, it may be that you felt sometimes that the way your government worked wasn't just right. Maybe something happened in your city government or in your county or in your state or even at the federal level, and you thought, that just doesn't seem right. That's just wrong to have that happen. That's awfully corrupt. Well, it probably was. Corruption in the government is very common because it has human beings in it, and we tend to be corrupt. Lots of stories in the Old Testament about corrupt governments as well. One of the most interesting, I think, is the one in 1 Kings 21. 1 Kings 21, you have King Ahab, who had a famous wife. What was her name? Jezebel. How many of you have ever known a child named Jezebel? I never have met one. I think there's a reason for that. Okay, so anyway, King Ahab goes to his neighbor, a guy named Naboth, and he says, would you sell me this plot of land you own because it adjoins the temple grounds and I'd like to have my vegetable garden there? And Naboth says, no, that's my family heritage for centuries or for decades. I'm not going to sell you that. So Ahab, the king, just gets really upset about that. And he goes home and he's pouting and he goes to bed and he lays there all day and he won't eat. His wife comes in and she says, don't worry, I'll get it for you. So let's just look at how she does it. We'll make a quick list. She writes letters, Jezebel, in Ahab's name. Well, I think that would be forgery. And she puts his official seal on it. That would be more forgery. And then she sends that letter to Naboth's city, the leaders of Naboth's city, where this innocent man lives. She tells them to hold a feast with Naboth present. That would be entrapment, I think, under our legal system. And she says, bring in 2 men who will lie and make up a story about Naboth being a criminal. And so they do that, and that's fraud, by the way. And she said, then once that's done and this man's convicted, take him out and kill him, which would be what? Murder. Okay, good day's work for Jezebel. But you know what happens? The guys in the city get the letter and they do exactly what they say, and the man's dead, and guess who gets his vegetable garden? King Ahab. Now that's some pretty serious corruption, and it's not a new thing. So when you see it in your government, you can get alarmed if you want, but it's nothing new if you see it. Now, no nation in history has ever continued permanently. Is that a true statement? Yes. Rome was powerful for a really long time, and where is it now? It's a city. It's not a country. There is no nation of Rome. There's no country that's ever continued forever. They always end. God brings up another in their place, or they fail for their own reasons, and it's never failed to happen. Maybe America will be the first exception to that rule. Maybe not. But we need to remember that we exist in history. Another issue of 2020 seems to be a dramatic increase in outright lying. Would you agree with that? I'm not making this up, I don't think, and I'm not being accusatory, but it just seems to be true. You just hear a lot of stuff, and if you're paying any attention, you think, well, that doesn't seem right, because it's not. Jesus had to deal with the lying. It's not a new thing at all. And he says in John 8, verse 44, he's talking to some people who are in his face and trying to get him in trouble. He says, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. Not a very polite thing to say. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Okay, so lying's not a new thing, but it's still a bad thing. Would you agree? We need to be discerning when we listen. When somebody tells us something, whether it's your neighbor or your local newspaper or somebody on Facebook or wherever you may get your information, we need to filter that. Is that true or not? And we need to know that if it's not true and it's intentionally not true, then that comes from a bad place. That comes from the wrong influence, and we need to respond accordingly. We could go on, but I think we've demonstrated here that God's in charge of governments and of human society, and that we can know that the outcome is at least under the control of God. Would you agree with that? And to me, that helps a great deal. as I see who is going to win this election, and I see that there's going to be legal contests, and I see that there's going to be disopinions and disagreements, I don't have to be anxious about that because God is in control. I may not like it. It may not be my preference. But if I'm going to say that I'm going to serve God first in humility, then I have to submit my own preferences, do I not? To what God's decided and go on with the service that He's called me to. I think there's a key there for us. So Jesus finally did come to earth after all these centuries of history in the Old Testament. And when He came, there was, of course, a government in charge when He came, and it was a pagan government. Not what you would have expected. It clearly wasn't a godly Christian environment in Rome, was it? They didn't even acknowledge the God that is the real God. They had a whole list of gods who did all kinds of things. And the Romans were known for a lot of things, but it wasn't morality. And Jesus then comes in that example, and the ruler of the Romans was called the emperor, right? And he was considered a god himself. So certainly that's not the type of process we see put forward that we should admonish and desire to live under, but that's where Jesus lived, it's where Paul lived, it's where the whole New Testament was written, and all of the comments we are going to look at now about how to deal with government were written in a time when they lived in a very non-Christian government, and makes it relevant to us as well. Our first text that we're going to look at about government interactions is with Jesus being put on the spot by some of His Jewish tormentors, trying to get Him in trouble over whether or not they should pay taxes to this pagan government. Jesus has asked them to show Him a coin, and they have given Him a coin, so He holds it up, and He says in Matthew 22, whose image is on this coin? And whose inscription? He's holding it back and forth, and they all know, Caesar's, they reply. Then He said, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And all the Jews there just went, oh. Because that's not what they wanted to hear. I guarantee it. He's saying, obey the rules. If it's their money, pay them their tax. You deal with God in a different way. We also have Romans. Paul, as we know, had a lot of issues and difficult treatment from the Roman government because they were being used as a tool by the Jewish detractors. But when we get to chapter 13 of the book of Romans, Paul gives some very detailed instructions as to how his readers, people who belong to Jesus Christ, are supposed to deal with governments. Let's read this together. We're not going to read every word, but much of it. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. That would include even the emperor of Rome. Consequently, whoever rebels against this authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. So he's saying, you may not like what the Roman governor does, but he's there because God put him there, so we have to follow these rules. Middle of part 4, verse 4. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it's necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. So Paul's writing about a non-Christian government, and he says, they have the law, we should obey the law. And what I think that means to us is, at the end of our election cycle here, some of us are glad about what the election appears it's going to be, some of us are not, but all of us need to move on in life. All of us need to accept this as being something God's in charge of, and it wouldn't have happened if He was negatively determined that it shouldn't. And so that's not our job. Our job is to go on in life and be the servants of God in humility, even unto tears. And that, hopefully, is helpful. Now, I do not propose that if you get a law in the next 6 months that says you should go over every Thursday and slap your neighbor's face. I don't think you should obey that law. Or any other equally foolish law that would put you in conflict with the things God has told us we should do. But until then, we're to be good citizens, as these verses teach us. You may say, but I don't want to do that because our government's going to be wicked. It has been wicked. It is wicked now. So I don't want to do some of these things. How am I supposed to deal with a non-Christian evil environment if that's how you determine it is? Well, we have an answer for that. Let's turn back to Genesis 6. Shortly before the flood, we get a little news report about the condition of society. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth. And listen to these words carefully. They're amazing. And He saw that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart, this would be if a person has a human heart, everything they are inclined to do was only evil. How often? Every Friday? No. All the time. Imagine that. Everybody in the whole world, this is saying, only thinks about evil things constantly. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I've created. But, what? Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Now, even in a totally 100% wicked society, Noah proved that it was possible to live righteously. And if this verse 6 is correct, that everybody was evil all the time, doesn't that mean the government, which would be made up of the citizens, would have to be evil as well? Yes. So living under even an evil government, as God would classify it, Noah was able to live righteously. But he literally was the only person who did, which is a pretty remarkable achievement. Now, I've heard some people say that things are a lot worse than they were when they were younger in our society. Some of you might agree with that. But I've also heard people say things have never been as bad as they are today. Well, this verse says that's not true, right? Because look around. There's hundreds of us here and on the internet and in other services around our valley and our country who don't think about evil all the time. So we are far from as bad as things have ever been. But it doesn't mean that we aren't in a society that will entice us to do wrong. But we find in Noah that he was able to deal with a wicked environment, a non-godly environment, and be righteous. How did he do that? It doesn't tell us exactly, but we know in Hebrews how we can do it. So we'll turn to Hebrews 11 now. You've no doubt read this chapter before. It's the Hall of Fame of faith. It's a really great text. The first 6 verses of Hebrews 11 explain that we absolutely have to have faith, because without faith there's no hope. We can't please God, and it's the key to our success in life in our dealing with God. The chapter then goes on to talk about famous people of faith: Abraham, Noah, Moses, Jacob, Joseph. Names a bunch of people who did all these great things, stories we know from the Old Testament. And then it goes and it says, but then there were others. And it doesn't give their names. And it says many of those other people, they were faithful too, but they didn't have all this great stuff to happen to them. And they had only difficulties. And life ended difficultly and hard for them. And then it goes to the verses we're going to look at. Verse 39. They were all commended for their faith, both the famous and the unfamous. Yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. So it's talking about all these historical creatures or people that we read about in the Old Testament, and many that we don't read about, lived lives of faith to God like we're all trying to do, and none of them ever received all the promises that they hoped for because it wasn't time yet. Paul is saying, the writer of Hebrews here is saying, we have to wait. They had to wait until our day, because in our day, we have a different way to live with God, correct? We live not under the law of Moses, but with the grace of Jesus. And that was the point of the entire history of the Old Testament. Those people had to wait to get to where we are. That's a pretty big deal, huh? And once we get to this place, then the good things happen. So here is the key, verse 13 and following. Each one of these people of faith died, not yet having in hand what was promised, but still believing. How did they do it? They saw it way off in the distance. What did they see? They saw through their faith the hope that there would be a time when we could live in grace directly as we do with Jesus Christ. And they wanted that. They didn't get to it. They were able to wave their greeting, the text says, and they accepted the fact that they weren't there yet because they were transients in this world. People who live this way make it plain that they are looking for their true home. If they were homesick for the old country, they would have gone back any time they wanted. But they were after a far better country than that, heavenly country. And you can see why God is so proud of them and has a city waiting for them. All right, complicated text there, but it's just basically saying that millions of people before us have lived faithfully to God, and they didn't necessarily die rich and happy, but they still died in the care of God. And that faith that kept them sustained was related to the future God had promised them. And they were able to understand that in the physical environment they were in, they didn't have everything they wanted yet, but they were going to a future environment where God truly would be all that they needed to worry about. And that's where we are. But because there's this disconnection between the physical location where we are now and the spiritual world we're trying to get to, we don't fit in this physical place. And this text says they realized they were transients. That's not a word we use very often. The NIV defines it as they realized they were foreigners and strangers in this world. The King James, which some of you have read in the past, says they were strangers and pilgrims. So actually, John Wayne wasn't the first person to say pilgrim. A pilgrim is what? Someone who's on a trip to some other place, right? A stranger is someone who doesn't belong in this place. A foreigner is someone who came from some other world. That's the descriptions that we get. And what would be a common description or a more normal word for a transient person in our society? Would be homeless. We're homeless in this world. Now that's kind of a jarring thought, isn't it? We have a lot of physically homeless people in our area. But I suspect that when we look at them, we may be compassionate and concerned for them, but we don't identify with them. I'm just like that person. But spiritually we are. We don't fit here. This text makes it crystal clear that we feel out of whack with our tumultuous world today because it's not our world. That's why the government of this world should not absorb our energies and our emotions and get us all worked up, because it's not our government. That's why we could ignore the resistance and pushback and maybe even scorn of our neighbors or people at our work or people we disagree with about politics or religion or does God exist or not. We don't have to take to heart those people's concerns because they're not our people. What do you think about that? You're pretty quiet. But isn't this a dramatic change in mindset? This place feels right to us because it's what we know. But it's not our normal place. We're trying to get to the next spot. The concept is something we need to be very aware of. That I don't need to be too emotionally invested in this world, in this government, in this society, in my bank account, in my personal situation, because it's temporary. It's hard to think that way, but God is telling us that's the reality. Now, in my youth in the South, we had a song about this. It was called, "This World Is Not My Home." How many of you know that song? Have ever heard it? Okay, what about over here? Any of you know that song? Okay, some of you? All right. Well, I really hope if you know it that you'll join in, because we're going to sing it now. And we won't go over it more than 4 or 5 times until everybody learns it. So the quicker you engage, the quicker we can go home and have lunch. But the reason I'd like you to sing it is that that's the best way to focus on the words and the meaning of it. Because it's a pretty cool song. And it captures this idea. So we're going to try it. This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. Oh, that is really not what I'd hoped for. You want another shot, or you just... Aren't you embarrassed a little bit? Here we go. I have faith in you. I do. Let's go. This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. You like that? Good. Good. 2 lines are very powerful. The first line of each paragraph. This world is not my home. I'm just passing through. Now, granted, it's the only world you know. You have never seen an angel. You have never talked to God face to face. You have never been in a place that has no stress and no pain and no loss and no concern and no duties that are unpleasant. You've never been in an environment like that, but that doesn't mean it's not real. So, that's the world where you belong, and that's the world where we're trying to get. And that's what this little phrase is telling us. And man, if that won't help us deal with the weirdness of a particular time like this, I don't know what will. And the second thing is, the beginning of the second verse, "O Lord, you know I have no friend like you." So the God who's been controlling the governments of the world for years, and who gives one nation to another and makes things happen that can't possibly happen, that God is the best friend you have. And that's a pretty big deal. All of you know somebody who's a name dropper. If you talk to them very long, well, you know, I was having lunch with the governor, blah, 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 or whatever. And maybe they were having lunch, but 7 other people, 100 people were as well, and they're on the 42nd row. They don't mention that part. Okay? Well, you can drop names too. Well, you know, God's and me are just like this. Try that. People look at you like you're crazy. But it's true. You have no friend like God. Those 2 facts, this world is not my home, and you have no friend like God, are the keys to how Paul and Nehemiah and Noah and all the heroes of faith and the people who weren't famous could serve God and persevere through every kind of challenge and difficulty, including a year like 2020, because those are the realities of life. And that's where they had their minds and their hearts. And that's how they got through the difficult times. The words and sentiment of that song are why I hope and pray and expect that each of us can leave here today and maybe feel better about the world and our society and whoever wins the election. We're uncomfortable here in 2020 because we're on temporary assignment. And yet we're exactly where we're supposed to be because God put us here in a strange and foreign place. And we're on our journey. But you need to know that while you're on your journey, no Oregon referendum law or no Republican or Democrat can wave you off of that if you don't want to be dissuaded. So my final thought to us today is, if we don't belong here, we thought we were Americans and we're not necessarily. If this isn't our place, what place do we have? And that's the best part. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. That's cool. chosen people, royal priesthood, holy nation, and God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. Okay, now, if you've been dozing the whole time, wake up for this. This is a true or false question. We only have one question in this test, so you have a chance to make 100%. True or false? Being chosen, royal, holy, and special to God, you personally, true or false, is better than being a Republican or a Democrat. All right. You got 100%. Okay. Peter goes on, once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as, well, look at it, there it is again, foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that although they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it's God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Have you encountered any foolish people talking ignorantly lately? Yes. Our job is to live as believers and show them how good people live, and they will be exposed for what they are. Verse 16, live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect for everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, and honor the emperor. So that's kind of how we're supposed to live. Now, chosen, royal priesthood, holy, and a special possession. And your nation is the kingdom of God. You just have your address in America. Pretty cool. Your fellow citizens are God's people, not the people in your town, of the nation that you belong to. So with that in mind, let's look at one last thought as we close. Go back to verse 16. Live as free people. Do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slave. I got to tell you that when I looked at this recently, I was pretty stunned by this word slave. Maybe I'd never seen it before. We went to Memphis recently. We went to the National Civil Rights Museum about slavery. Pretty bad thing. I don't think I want to be a slave. And I thought, well, how can I live as a free person in this verse and also be a slave to God? And as I thought about that some, I don't know if the Spirit helped me or what, but this idea came to me and I share it with you. We don't not like thinking about being a slave, but as I understand the duties of a slave, in the physical world at least, their job is one thing: to do what the master told them to do, period. To do it well, to do it completely, and to do it thoroughly. But once they do that one thing, they're not responsible for anything else, right? It's the master who has to make everything else work. The master's got to bring in the materials and provide their food and provide their home and provide all the things they need and take care of them and protect them and give them their day off and do all the stuff that the master has to be in charge of. Well, if you're the slave and your job is just to serve the master who is God, isn't there a lot of freedom in turning the rest of it completely over to God? That to me was helpful. Hopefully it will be to you as we deal with 2020. So Paul's formula to success was to serve God humbly so that my needs are after God's, even to tears if it causes me pain, and everything else will take care of itself. And I think that's how we can handle 2020, because that means God's in charge. John 14 is our last words. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that was not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. Now you got to like that. Thank you for listening so carefully, and hopefully it will be helpful as we deal with 2020. The communion has been prepared for those who want to partake. The gentleman here front will be willing, and in the back there, to hand it out to you, and then return to your seats if you would. You know whose people we are? We know that we belong to God because of the amazing determination and pursuit of God through history to bring us into relationship with Him through Jesus. So as we hold this little piece of bread here, it's to remind us that Jesus came and did everything that God is able to do to bring us into relationship with Him. So if we want to live in joy and peace and a gracious, calm place, we can do so knowing that Jesus has paved the way and that we belong to Him. So let's reflect on that as we eat this emblem. Dear God, we thank You so much for what You've done. We thank You for Your love and Your care. We thank You for salvation. We thank You that You are in charge of the world, whatever happens, and that we don't have to worry about the outcome because You have it handled. We thank You, God, that most of all, You provided for us through Jesus Christ and salvation through grace and brought us to a place where we belong to You completely as Your children. Help us to live as successful slaves to You, God, and have joy and peace no matter what may rage around us because of Jesus. In this name we say together, amen. It says all throughout the Old Testament that life is in the blood. And to prove that and make His point, when Jesus came, it was ordained that He would die in a specific way so that blood physically flowed and we could see it, those people watching. That's what this little cup is an emblem of, to know that that was the extent that God was willing to go to for us. Well, let's partake. Thank you for being here today. Put your masks on like good citizens. I appreciate your attention through a long message, and may you be blessed. If you have a need for prayer, there'll be some people in the corner over here who are especially good at it. If you have other questions or needs, there'll be people up here to speak with you. Have a blessed day, and don't freeze to death. Thank you.